101 seconds were all it took for a Boeing 747 to disappear into the Arabian Sea. There was no explosion, no fire, and no structural failure to warn the passengers inside. On January 1, 1978, Air India Flight 855 departed from Bombay under a moonless and silent sky. The aircraft was a Boeing 747 named Emperor Ashoka, carrying 213 people on board. The engines roared smoothly as the jet accelerated down the runway for departure. The takeoff was normal, stable, and exactly as expected for a routine night flight. Within seconds, the aircraft climbed into total darkness over the Arabian Sea. Behind them, the lights of Bombay faded quickly into the distance. Ahead of the cockpit windows, there was no visible horizon at all. Captain Madan Lal Kukar commanded the aircraft from the left seat with thousands of hours of experience. First Officer Indu Vermani monitored the instruments carefully from the right side. Everything appeared normal as the landing gear retracted and the climb continued. But seconds after liftoff, the captain's attitude indicator began showing incorrect information. The instrument falsely suggested the aircraft was banking left. In reality, the wings were nearly level and the climb was stable. At night over open water, pilots must rely completely on their instruments. Without outside references, the human body cannot detect subtle changes in bank angle. Trusting the faulty instrument, the captain applied gentle right control input. He was correcting a bank that did not actually exist. The aircraft responded by slowly rolling to the right instead. The movement was gradual and almost impossible to feel inside the cabin. Passengers sensed nothing unusual as the aircraft continued climbing. Inside the cockpit, however, the situation was already beginning to change. The difference between perception and reality was growing second by second. If you want to understand what happened in the sky 101 seconds after takeoff, subscribe now and stay with this investigation. Because what followed was not sudden chaos, but a quiet descent into fatal disorientation. As the aircraft continued climbing, the right bank slowly increased beyond what the captain believed was level flight. On his faulty attitude indicator, the wings still appeared slightly tilted to the left. To him, the correction seemed incomplete and still necessary. In reality, the Boeing 747 was now banking steadily to the right. First Officer Vermani began noticing the disagreement between his own instruments and the captain's display. His attitude indicator showed a growing right bank that required correction in the opposite direction. Inside the cockpit, two different realities were forming at the same time. One pilot trusted the instrument directly in front of him. The other pilot saw a completely different picture of the aircraft's position. At night over the sea, there was no external horizon to confirm which display was correct. The darkness outside offered no reference, no distant lights, and no visual cues. The aircraft continued rolling slowly, passing 10 degrees of right bank without immediate alarm. The climb rate began decreasing as the bank angle increased, but the engines were still producing strong thrust and no system warning sounded. Captain Kukar applied more right input, believing he was fighting a left roll. Each correction pushed the aircraft further into a real right bank. The bank angle passed 20 degrees, then 30, without the captain realizing it. The Boeing 747 is stable, but physics does not negotiate with perception. As the bank increases, lift tilts sideways and vertical climb performance decreases. The nose began lowering slightly as the aircraft struggled to maintain altitude. First Officer Vermani attempted to communicate the disagreement between the instruments. He called out the bank angle as shown on his own display. But in high workload situations, conflicting information creates hesitation. When two instruments disagree, the human mind searches for confirmation, not contradiction. The captain believed his instrument was reliable and interpreted the warnings as overcorrection. Meanwhile, the aircraft passed 40 degrees of right bank. At this angle, the descent rate begins increasing rapidly, if not corrected immediately. Passengers inside the cabin may have felt a subtle shift, but nothing dramatic yet. There was still no structural stress, no vibration, and no sign of mechanical failure. This was not a broken airplane. This was a growing illusion inside a functioning cockpit. Air traffic control had cleared the flight to continue climbing after departure. There was no distress call at this stage. The crew still believed they were in control of the situation. But in the dark sky above the Arabian Sea, spatial disorientation had already taken hold. the aircraft passed 50 degrees of right bank as altitude began slipping away, and the most critical seconds were still ahead. By now, less than a minute had passed since the wheels had left the runway in Bombay. The aircraft was no longer in a gentle climb, but in a steep and dangerous right bank. The bank angle exceeded 60 degrees as the nose continued dropping toward the sea. At this angle, the aircraft could no longer maintain altitude with climb power alone. Lift was no longer acting vertically enough to keep the aircraft stable. Instead, the Boeing 747 began losing height while still accelerating forward. First Officer Vermani urgently called out the increasing bank angle again. His instruments clearly showed the aircraft rolling far beyond safe limits. The captain, still trusting his faulty indicator, believed the opposite correction was required. He continued applying right input, convinced he was leveling the wings. The disagreement in the cockpit had become critical. Two trained pilots were looking at different versions of reality. The bank passed 70 degrees, an angle rarely seen outside extreme maneuvers. At such an angle, the horizon disappears completely from peripheral vision. Inside the cockpit, alarms finally began activating as altitude decreased rapidly. The ground proximity warning system sensed the sudden descent toward the sea. A mechanical voice would have warned of sinking terrain below. But by this point, reaction time was nearly gone. The aircraft rolled past 90 degrees, nearly vertical in the night sky. Passengers may have felt a sudden, powerful sideways force for the first time. Loose items in the cabin would have shifted violently. The nose dropped sharply as gravity took control of the aircraft's trajectory. The engines were still running at power, but power alone cannot overcome physics. The Boeing 747 was now descending at a catastrophic rate. In the final seconds, the bank exceeded 100 degrees to the right. The aircraft was effectively in a steep spiral dive toward the Arabian Sea. There was no structural breakup in the air. There was no explosion before impact. There was only speed, darkness, and confusion inside the cockpit. Exactly 101 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft struck the water. The impact was violent and unsurvivable for all 213 people on board. The sea closed over the wreckage within moments. Air traffic control lost radar contact almost instantly. There was no Mayday call transmitted before the crash. What had begun as a routine night departure ended as one of India's deadliest aviation disasters. And the cause was not engine failure, not weather, and not structural weakness. The official investigation would later confirm that the aircraft itself was fully airworthy and mechanically capable of completing the flight without difficulty. There was no evidence of engine malfunction, structural weakness, fuel imbalance, or flight control failure at any stage of the departure. Instead, investigators focused on the captain's attitude indicator, which had failed immediately after liftoff and began presenting misleading information. The instrument falsely showed a left bank, even as the aircraft was rolling progressively to the right over open water. In daylight, visual references outside the cockpit would likely have exposed the false indication within seconds. But at night over the sea, the human body becomes unreliable and easily deceived. Spatial disorientation occurs when inner ear sensations conflict with instrument data. Pilots can feel level while banking, or feel banking while perfectly level, depending on acceleration forces. Without cross-checking all instruments and establishing clear crew coordination, investigators concluded that the captain trusted his faulty display and continued correcting for a non-existent left roll. Meanwhile, the first officer saw the true bank angle increasing on his own independent instruments. The disagreement inside the cockpit was never fully resolved before impact. Crew resource management procedures were less formalized in the 1970s than they are today. Modern training emphasizes assertive communication and immediate instrument cross-verification during disagreement. In 1978, cockpit hierarchy often placed final authority firmly in the captain's interpretation. By the time the descent became obvious and warning systems activated, recovery altitude had already been lost. The aircraft entered the water intact, confirming that loss of control, not structural breakup, caused the crash. All 213 passengers and crew lost their lives in the dark waters off the coast of Bombay. Air India Flight 855 became a defining case study in spatial disorientation and instrument failure management. The tragedy reinforced the importance of redundant attitude systems and disciplined instrument scanning. It also reshaped training programs worldwide, particularly for night departures over featureless terrain. Today, pilots practice unreliable attitude indicator scenarios repeatedly in simulators. They are trained to identify faulty instruments within seconds and rely on cross-checking procedures. But on that January night in 1978, those 101 seconds unfolded without visual reference, without clarity, and without time to recover. A fully functional aircraft was lost not to mechanical destruction, but to a moment of human disorientation. And in aviation, even a single incorrect perception, left unchallenged, can outweigh thousands of flight hours.